cannot be any huge-scale revolution until there's a personal revolution. On an individual basis, it's got to happen inside first. I really believe in our culture today that we need an intentional revolution to help us move through the stigma that can surround mental health. And so today I want to be able to explore how the power of our story is so powerful, necessary, and vital in helping us move through that stigma. A few years ago, I got the absolute privilege to be able to have a job opportunity in New Zealand to work with youth, college students, and families throughout both of the islands in New Zealand. And then after 4 years there and pastoring a few churches, which was an incredible experience, and I don't work for a travel agency, but if you ever get to go, you need to go to New Zealand. It's awesome. And then I thought, well, while I'm down here in the Southern Hemisphere, I think I'll just skip over to Australia and see what it's like living there. So I went over, no job, 2 suitcases, knew no one, and and all my children were grown, and I landed in Western Australia again on the Indian Ocean, beautiful part of the world. And I had the honor to be appointed as the State Chaplain of a first responder organization. This first responder organization actually covers the biggest area in the entire world. So it was me as the state chaplain and a car. And I looked over this vast new office that I had, and it was 1 million square miles. And there were 8,000 first responders and their families, around 50,000 people that were now in my care. Not overwhelming at all. So I looked over this landscape, literally, and I began to travel throughout the state. And what I found was a tremendous workforce who did tremendous work as paramedics throughout this very geographically diverse area. Strong, resilient people. And I found this workforce that longed to support each other from a mental health perspective and to deal with the things that they were finding themselves dealing with on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis. But they didn't have the language for it. And of course, in first responders, there was such a stigma that they wouldn't dare start to talk about this. So I looked over and I thought, wow, they need so much more than just my pastoral skills. What am I going to do here? And I began to talk with this organization, and I was allowed to be able to put together a strategy that went way beyond just pastoral care. And it was such a tremendous journey for me that I started to look into something called psychological first aid. And how do I begin to implement that to help us to begin to support each other to get support? And so as I did that, I'm going to try this clicker. These are things that I began to ponder. There was a TED Talk that I came in touch with, Dr. Kelly McGonigal from Stanford University, called Make Stress Your Friend. Changed my life. Who knew that stress makes us social? Who knew that the way that we think about distress and stress and trauma actually changes the way that our heart even functions around stress? Who knew how awesome we were that when we are in times of distress and stress, that our heart has receptors on it that pull oxytocin toward us to help mitigate the effects of stress? Who knew that? Did you? Oh my goodness, we are awesome. We are wired to survive. And I begin then to think, this changes everything. I know that part of my story is my experience and my own narrative and what I carry with me. But I didn't know that biologically this also was a part of my story. that I am resilient, that I am wired to survive. It was phenomenal. And one of the things that Kelly also says in her video is that biologically, that stress makes us social, and that we are, when in times of distress, the best thing that we can do is to connect with one another. Now, we know from all the research that's coming forward in the last few years that shared responsibility and social contact is so vital in our mental health and being healthy and being resilient. So she just says, when you're under stress, connect, reach out, tell somebody. Don't hold it, don't carry it. That's debilitating. That's an exhausting way to live. I thought, right on, girl, we're going to do that. The next thing was a book that came out a couple of years ago by Dr. Ted George from the National Institute of Health called Untangling the Mind. And I began to read this book. And what's so fascinating about this book is that here's 30 years of research. And he wrote this book with a fiction novelist. So it reads like a story. And what he's saying to us is that you can do mental health. Here's 30 years of all this research that is not accessible to us. And the way that he wrote this book was incredible. And I got it. And I thought, well, if I can get it, anybody can get it. There was also, obviously, All Things Brene Brown that I began to read. And the importance and how vital it is to our being resilient and to our mental health to embrace our vulnerability. Pretty much what Kelly McGonigal is saying, connect, which means if you're going to connect, you're going to be vulnerable. The fourth thing that came into my path was a clinical research study that came out of Canada around first aid and people knowing CPR. And here's what this study said, that they saw that the more people that knew first aid, if you're in the mall or on the street and somebody went into cardiac arrest, if you had one of us, the general public, who knew CPR and began CPR immediately, that the survival rate went up, I think it was 67% with no neurological damage. So how cool. So basically that study is saying the more of us that know first aid, and we can be proactive in helping someone while we're waiting for the experts to get to that space, the better our survival rate. I started thinking and putting all these things together. And I thought to myself, well, if you can do that with CPR, can we do that with psychological first aid? I wonder if the more of us that understand how to respond, like psychological CPR, what would that look like for our mental health? What would it look like if we were able to connect with each other on that level while we were helping each other navigate our way to the experts? And what I began to understand and think about, I thought, well, let's just do this. I mean, Kelly says when you're under stress, connect. So let's connect. How easy is that to tell someone what's going on with you? Do we do that as a culture? Is that easy for us? It's because we don't want to be vulnerable. You know, our culture really helps us understand that, what's the old commercial, never let them see you sweat? Because we do know that people will take our vulnerability and they sometimes can use it as a weapon against us. And our culture tells us to have it all together. Don't be weak. Be strong. And so I think that our biology and culture, as they're battling each other, they're killing our resilience. We're exhausted. Do you know that anxiety now is the number one mental health issue in the Western world? Why is that? And what sits at the heart of anxiety? It's fear. I'm so afraid that if I connect with you and tell you what's going on with me, that I'm going to face rejection and judgment. Do you know there's a study that goes around about every year or so in the Western world, and the question is, what is the number one thing that we are most afraid of? Do you know the answer? I'll give you a hint. Death is normally number 4. Do you know what the number one answer is to that question? Public speaking. Are you serious? We would rather die than public speak? And I see some of you going, yeah, we really would. What sits at the heart of that answer? What sits at the heart? What? Vulnerability. What happens when we stand up much like this? We give of ourselves. We give something very intimate and very personal. We do make ourselves vulnerable. And we know that we can walk out and go, what was she wearing? What was up with that accent? You know, I don't even know what she said. We know that we can come under very harsh judgment and rejection from each other. I said earlier that we are wired to survive. And it suddenly began to dawn on me that, you know, back in the day when I was born with the Flintstones, you know, the thing that we had to survive, you know, we needed food and shelter. Our survival skills we don't need that anymore. What is the thing that we're having to survive the most? Each other. If we are so powerful in each other's lives that we can actually affect someone's life that we don't even know by cyberbullying, can you imagine the power that we can unleash if we begin to support each other to get support? So I took all this into consideration as a chaplain, and I thought, I believe all this. I wonder if we can really live like this. And I thought, well, I'm going to try. So I have to give credit where credit is due. I went to the CEO and the executive directors of this massive first responder organization, and I said, we got to do something. And here's what I think we got to do. We've got all this research that's fantastic. We've got all this expertise with clinical psychologists and people that we can go to see. But there's something in the middle that's missing, and I think it's us. I think it's the way we treat each other in this workforce. And I think we need to harness this desire for this workforce to support each other and give them tools to be able to do that. Now, I wish I could say to you that I just kind of showed up everywhere in that million square miles and said, just be vulnerable. Tell your story. Share. And they went, okay, love it. Let's do that. Didn't happen that way. When we began to put this intentional strategy where we were asking people to support each other to get support, when we developed an educational foundation model and we made a commitment as an organization to train 8,000 people and their families every year around 1 million square miles in person, not by video, to be able to be there with them, to help them unpack their fear, their shame, and to be able to give them a common language as a workforce, to be able to know how to support each other, to get support. I keep saying that because that's really important. We were not asking people to be the support. That's too overwhelming to do that. We're saying support each other to get support, to help each other to navigate our way through to the expertise. And I'll go with you. And I'm going to give you permission to know that it is okay to be hurt by your personal relationships. It's okay for you when you go to a horrible job to be affected. And to be able to work through and move through that distress and trauma. I don't know where we get that we ever thought that we were weak. Because I don't know about you, but the fears that I've had to face in my own life have taken more courage than anything I've ever done. So to stand in that fear with each other and say, hey, mate, that's Australian, just in case. Hey, mate, you're not doing so well. You know, I wasn't doing so well a few months ago, and I went to see somebody, and it was awesome. Come on, I'll go with you. Let's do this. We're 4 years in to this strategy just being put on the ground. I've just gotten the numbers back over the last 2.5 years. We had a 600% increase of the workforce accessing support services. 600%. Two things led to that. Evidence-based information like Dr. George's book delivered in the narrative. You can do mental health. You can't just, you can do more than just know about it. You can actually do it. And this tremendous workforce decided that they were going to be courageous enough to care for each other and move through slowly through our fear and our shame. So, with the education and the skills to be able to speak to each other, what does that mean for us now? Because this isn't just about first responders, is it? It's about us and who we are as a culture. I said in the beginning that I think we need an intentional revolution that starts with us. So what do? Wherever you are, start an intentional revolution. In your schools, on your campuses, in your hospitals. We even taught a bunch of grocery stores in Australia about it to help them be a better workforce. Embrace your vulnerability and find a safe place. Be a safe place for someone. Because we all suffer, but we don't have to suffer alone. Thank you.